Introduction. Purpose and application of course book and training. Of course, it's to train public housing authorities on requirements relating to procurement practices. The handbook also applies to general PHA staff and its leadership, including board members. The handbook, everybody is beholden to the handbook. You are required as a procurement professional, and whether you have the term procurement in your title or not, you're still responsible. Even the maintenance person going out to pick up supplies is a procurement professional because they're buying stuff. You're required to understand the guidebook, Procurement Handbook 7460.8, Revision 2, soon to be hopefully Revision 3. The new CFR, 2 CFR 200-317 through 200-326, including the appendices. Now, a lot of folks who have been around a while, you're familiar with 24 CFR 8536. That left us 4 or 5 years ago. It's now 2 CFR 200-317 through 326. And if you haven't updated your procurement policy, you need to do so. That should have been done quite a while ago. I don't think it's a major violation, but you need to update your policy for it with that. All mandatory HUD forms that are to be included in any procurement process, some of them we'll talk about today and tomorrow. And then, of course, you always have to look at your state and local procurement laws and see how they interact with the federal. Source requirements. Remember, our governing CFR is 2 CFR 200-317 through 326. This is the regulation governing or controlling our procurement activities. And one of the main points, and this is where people get into trouble so much, is you must provide for full and open competition. Doing stuff to restrict vendors from getting to your work is prohibited, unless, of course, they are somebody that you have prohibited for a reason. And there's quite a process to go through to do that. You will follow the stricter of federal, state, and local laws. We'll talk about a few of those and how they interact with each other during the seminar. Consistency with good business practices, overall objectives, open, fair, reasonable, and competitive access to your housing authority is required. Because of what I do, I sometimes help housing authorities when they've gotten into trouble. Findings. One of the most quoted sections is always the one where HUD or the OIG says, you are not open, fair, reasonable, and justified in what you did. So open competitive access to your competitions or even your work if there's not a competition is a requirement. We are to be a good steward of public funds. Remember, this is sacred money. This money that we're administering, that we spend to maintain our sites, to buy the services we need, was taken from the citizens of this country involuntarily. None of us volunteer to pay taxes. So those are sacred funds and we need to watch over them. We're always looking for the best value product or service. Despite that, for instance, quotes and bids are a low-cost award. We know that when you do a quote, who gets the award, the lowest cost. It doesn't mean that just because somebody submits a lowest cost that you're actually going to complete an award to them, because we're always looking for the best value. We'll talk about that more. It is your responsibility to comply with all applicable laws, HUD regulations, and your own policies. And those policies need to be based on a combination of federal requirements and local laws. That's typically your procurement policy. And then we also are going to want to, of course, avoid ethical pitfalls. We'll talk about ethics in Chapter 4. Public access to procurement information. Some information is considered public. In fact, I would say that most of what you do is at some point considered to be public information and must be released in accordance with your laws, your policies, your local laws, HUD, Freedom of Information Act. We're going to talk about a couple of those as we go through the guidebook, because we don't release everything right at the moment they may want. Some things we release while we're doing the procurement, the competition. Some things we release later, and we'll talk about those things. Sometimes information that we don't release might be proprietary business information from the bidders or the contractors. For instance, a lot of their competitors would like to get a hold of their client list. And they will put the client list typically inside their proposal or their bid, especially if we ask for it, so that we can judge them or evaluate them based on their experience. However, it has been my experience that most attorneys say, no, you don't release their client list. Or if you do an RFP, for instance, and somebody puts in a audited financial statement of their firm, I've never had an attorney say that had to be. And the reason is because it's proprietary business information. However, remember, their cost is not proprietary. Everybody's entitled to know eventually the costs that everybody proposed. How many of you ever been to a public bid opening? We read the costs right off the bat, right? Yeah, that's public knowledge. Detailed pricing, however, might be proprietary. If we ask somebody to turn in their calculations on how they arrived at their pricing, that's an unusual thing to do, but I've done it before. That has been deemed by my attorneys at my agency and at agencies that I work with to be proprietary. Sometimes their technical data or how they arrive at certain conclusions might be proprietary. All of this stuff has to be worked with an attorney, your attorney, or perhaps even talk to HUD, but with your attorney if somebody asks for that kind of information. One thing that we never, ever disclose during the bid is our independent cost estimate. You know why? Because that tends to give people targets, and we don't want them to give us pricing based on a target. We want them to give us pricing based on how are they going to make money. If they can't figure that out, we probably don't want to do business with them. They would not be a best value procurement. Be sure that whenever anybody asks for information, you don't give the information just to one person who asked it. You give it to everybody by issuing an addendum. And then after the bid deadline, it would not be an addendum. It would be a post-bid submittal notice, something like that. But I never, ever give information to just one person only. There's actually a housing authority in a northeastern state who the OIG has moved on because they refused to answer questions to everybody. They only answered them to the person, and they've gotten into a lot of trouble. The question is, what's an example of a post-bid deadline notice? Here's an example. If somebody said, after the bids are all done, I want to see everybody's bid, or I want to see a certain vendor's bid, I would not just show them the bid. I would make PDF copies of the bids and send them to everybody. If bidder A asked to see bidder B's submittal, I would not show bidder A that submittal. I would make copies of all the submittals and send them to everybody, including bidder A, the first bidder who asked to see the other bidder's submittal. If we decide, whatever we decided to show, I would show it to everybody at the same time. That's an example of a notice. See, it can't be an addendum because an addendum is what you issue during a bid. But after the bid is done, you can't amend or do an addendum, you just do a notice. Course agenda. We've been through the introduction. We're going to talk about procurement authority and administration of the procurement function, including policies, the duties of the contracting officer, obligation of funds, and staffing and training. We're going to talk about, in the next chapter, general requirements, including procurement planning, the individual procurement plans that you're required to have a form of, what documentation you're required to have in the file, and what you're required to do to ensure appropriate funding appropriate payments, and the internal controls that you have to have. In Chapter 4, we're going to talk about ethics in public contracting, conflicts of interest, gratuities, kickbacks, and confidential information. You know of all of those? The biggest problem is confidential information. It's not gratuities and kickbacks. We already know we're not supposed to be taking anything, right? That's easy. We just don't take it. But it's confidential information, making sure that whatever you release is not confidential. Sanctions for violations. Chapter 5, we're going to talk about small purchase procedures, micro and small purchases, ID, indefinite delivery contracts, purchase orders, and mandatory forms. A lot of folks talk about, I made 3 phone calls to get 3 quotes. And then once we look at the requirements, we find out that's very problematic. That's very difficult to do. Yeah, and being compliant. Chapter 6, we're going to talk about sealed bids, also known as invitation for bids or IFB. We're going to concentrate on the bid openings and how you do the contract award. Chapter 7, competitive proposals, including RFPs and RFQs, requests for qualification. Chapter 8 is non-competitive procurement. Do you know that the largest procurements you make are non-competitive in nature? You don't compete. Yeah, we'll talk about that. We'll identify them and the documentation that you're required to have in the file to justify those non-competitive. Chapter 9, specifications and statements of work, what you have to issue to get what you need to ensure that you can have a good contract. Chapter 10 is a large chapter, the miscellaneous requirements. We're going to talk about contract pricing types, and we're going to talk about contractor responsibility, cost and price analysis, protests and options, and labor standards. Large chapter. Chapter 11 is contract administration. How do we ensure that what we're paying for is what we're actually received? Yeah, that's where housing authorities get into a lot of trouble. I do audits at some housing authorities, and I go to their accounts payable files, and I look at the invoice, and they paid it, and I say, did you get this? They go, oh yeah. I go, how would I know that? You didn't sign the invoice. Just sign the invoice. But those who sign invoices have to realize that when I sign that invoice, what am I verifying? Yeah, that it was all received. So we're going to talk about contract administration for both construction contracts and non-construction because it's actually a bit different. And we're going to talk about contract modifications. A contract modification is also known as a change order. Yes, or an amendment to the contract. We're going to talk about state and local laws and regulations pertaining to procurement. Okay, which ones, where you find those laws, how they can differ. We're going to talk about HUD review requirements, things that you have to get prior HUD approval for before you buy it. They're very few, but they're there. We're going to talk about cooperative purchasing relationships, meaning sometimes portion of that is called piggybacking, buying off of bids done by other government agencies, a good thing to do, a very good thing to do. And HUD does not just allow it, HUD encourages you to do it. They say so in the CFR. We encourage you to buy off of bids done by other government agencies. We're going to talk about resident-owned businesses, small, minority, and other disadvantaged businesses. We're going to talk about public, that's chapter 15. We're going to talk about private partnerships and utility purchasing, which is a little different than it is when I first started.